The First Opium War Continuation. The Fall of the Qing Dynasty, Part 5, Section C. After the Second Battle of Chuanpe on January 7, 1841, British Plenipotentiary Charles Elliot and Chinese Imperial Commissioner Qishan negotiated the Convention of Chuanpe on January 20th. One of the conditions was that the port of Canton, Guangzhou, was to be opened for trade on February 2nd. However, no proclamation for the opening of the port appeared. On February 11th to 12th, Elliot and Qishan met again at the Bow. Elliot agreed to a further delay that was not to exceed 10 days, while the treaty conditions were prepared. Commodore James Gordon Bremer, Commander-in-Chief of the British forces at the time, wrote in his dispatch, "I must confess that from this moment my faith in the sincerity of the Chinese commissioner was completely destroyed. My doubts were also strengthened by the reports of the officers I sent up to the place of meeting, who stated that military works on a great scale were in progress, troops collected on the heights, and camps protected by entrenchments arising on both sides of the river, and that the island of North Wang Tong had become a mass of cannons." Suspecting warlike intentions on the part of the Chinese, Bremer sailed to the Macau Roads, which is an anchorage east of Macau, on February 13th to confer with Elliot. He found that the HMS Nemesis was on the way to Canton to demand verification of the convention, and had orders to wait until the night of February 18th for an answer. On the morning of February 19th, the Nemesis returned without a reply, and all doubt regarding the hostile intention of the Chinese ended when the ship came under fire from North Wang Tong. Later that evening, Qishan's and Elliot's intermediary, Pao Pang, arrived in Macau in a chop boat, announcing Qishan's refusal to sign the treaty and demanding 10 more days to consider it. However, Elliot replied that fair means had been exhausted. Bremer detached the HMS Calliope, Samarang, Herald, Alligator, Modeste, and Sulphur under Captain Thomas Herbert to prevent further defensive preparations. In response, a proclamation from the Lieutenant Governor of Canton, Il Yang, announced a $30,000 equivalent reward for the heads of Bremer and Elliot, and $50,000 for anyone who could seize them alive, among other rewards. The Battle of the Bogue. Here is a map of the battle showing Anohoi and the Wantong Islands. On February 23rd, Captain Herbert, accompanied by Elliot, sailed to the rear passage of Anohoi Island aboard the Nemesis, along with the pinnaces Calliope, Samarang, Herald, and Alligator in a flotilla. As the fleet tried to clear the stakes placed across the river, they unexpectedly encountered a masked 20-gun battery almost abreast of the spot. The battery immediately opened fire. The Nemesis responded with a volley of grape and canister shots from the bow and stern guns, while the smaller pinnaces sailed towards the shore to storm the battery. They opened fire with their bow guns as they advanced. Herbert reported that 30 small Chinese junks and boats were making off in the greatest confusion. Our return fire was rapid, and so energetically followed up by a landing and pushing on to the attack that the fort was immediately in our possession. The Chinese fled after a slight resistance, whereupon their magazines, a few junks, and some boats were burned. The British disabled the 20 mounted guns of various caliber by breaking their trunnions. An additional 60 dismounted guns were found and rendered useless, excluding a few brass ones, which were taken as trophies. There were no British casualties. Herbert reported 20 to 30 Chinese dead. On the same day, former Imperial Commissioner Lin Zexu wrote in his diary, "I hear that 2 small steamers belonging to the rebel English, with several small boats, sailed straight up to Taiping Shu, behind Anson's Bay, in the boat, opened fire, and set alight a number of peasants' houses, and also the customs house. Since South Wangtong Island was unfortified by the Chinese, the British set up a battery there to target the forts on North Wangtong Island, which would also divert attention from the upcoming attack on Anong Hoi. Shortly after midday on February 25th, the Nemesis embarked 130 troops of the 37th Madras Infantry, the MNI, to assist in erecting a mortar battery on the island. In the evening, Captain W.J. Birdwood of the Madras Sappers and fellow engineer officers, with a working party of Royal and Madras artillery, covered by the 37th MNI, erected a sandbag battery on the saddle in the middle of the island. 2 8-inch iron and 1 24-pounder brass howitzer were put in position. During construction, the North Wangtong batteries fired during much of the night, but their shots passed mostly above the site and slackened towards 2 a.m. At daylight on February 26th, the 3 howitzers fired shells and rockets into North Wangtong, and occasionally into Anong Hoi. British troops were ordered to be ready at 7 a.m., but due to calm weather, the operation was delayed until 11 a.m., when the breeze was strong enough to sail. Here is a Chinese drawing of the Anong Hoi forts, found in the House of Guan, representing the expected attack of the British. Anong Hoi's defenses were the 42-gun South Anong Hoi Fort, Weiyuan, the 60-gun Jinyuan Fort, north of Weiyuan, and the 40-gun North Anong Hoi Fort, Zhenyuan. Captain Humphrey Fleming Senhouse of the HMS Blenheim, assisted by the HMS Melville, the steamer HMS Queen, and 4 rocket boats, approached the southern fort, dropped its anchor 600 yards or 550 meters away, and fired broadsides from its starboard guns. The Melville approached 5 minutes later off the port side of the Blenheim, sailing within 400 yards or 370 meters of the fort, and fired broadsides in quick succession. A British officer wrote, "The firing of these ships was most splendid. Nothing could withstand their deadly aim. 1 or 2 shots were sufficient for the dragon-hearted defenders of the North Fort, who, letting off their guns, fled up the hills." The landing, at 1:20 p.m., after bombarding and silencing the forts, Senhouse landed on the southern battery with about 300 Royal Marines and Bluejackets, or sailors, carrying small arms to clear out the few remaining defenders. The same was done to the other 2 batteries. By 1:30 p.m., the forts were captured. Chinese Admiral Guan Tianpei was among the estimated 250 killed or wounded at Anung Hoi. After his family identified the body the next day, the Blenheim fired a minute gun salute in his honor as the body was taken away. A Chinese bell that Sandhouse captured was later sent to England and donated to St. Mary's Church in Gosforth by his widow in 1844. North Wangtong's defenses were the Wangtong Fort, Hengdang, on the eastern side, and the 40-gun Yong'an Fort on the western side, flanked by a fieldwork of 17 guns. A boom connected South Wangtong to the South Anung Hoi Fort, where it was heaved or lowered by a windlass. It was composed of 4 parts of chain cable, supported by wooden rafts. A passage was not forced through it until after the forts were taken. The HMS Wellesley, Commander Bremer's flagship, and HMS Druid targeted the southwest batteries, while the Light Division under Captain Herbert, comprising of the Calliope, Samarang, Herald, Alligator, Modeste, and Sulphur, targeted the northwest and southeast batteries of the island, which had 2,000 Chinese defenders. In less than an hour, the batteries were silenced. At 1:30 p.m., under Major Thomas Simpson Pratt, 1,037 troops from the 26th and 49th Regiments, 37th MNI, Bengal Volunteers, and Royal Marines landed on the rear of the southwest fort from the steamers Nemesis and Madagascar. Within minutes, the British captured the island, and 1,300 Chinese surrendered. An estimated 250 Chinese were killed or wounded in Wangtong, and 167 guns were captured. In total, 5 British were wounded, and 339 artillery pieces were captured that day. Lin wrote in his records, "I got home at the hour of the monkey, 3 p.m., and when night came, heard that the Bogue forts and those on Wangtong Island were being invested, preparatory to attack, by the English rebels. I at once went with Deng to Kishan's office, and at the hour of the rat, 11 p.m., we heard that Wangtong, Yong'an, and Kung Ku forts had fallen. All night I could not sleep." The Battle of First Bar. Here is an image of the attack on the First Bar Battery. On the morning of February 27th, Calliope, Herald, Alligator, Sulphur, Modeste, and the steamers Madagascar and Nemesis sailed past the Boca Tigris along the Pearl River. Lieutenant John Elliott Bingham of the Modeste wrote, "As the ship sped along, the shore was lined with thousands of the inhabitants gazing at the bold barbarians, many of them, no doubt, secretly wishing them success." Commodore James Gordon Bremer, Commander-in-Chief of British Forces, placed Captain Thomas Herbert of Calliope in command of the fleet. After sailing past Tiger Island and Second Bar, they reached near First Bar Island by noon. There, the British spotted Cambridge, a former East Indiaman, hoisting the flag of a Chinese admiral. The long Chinese field fortifications facing the river mounted 47 guns. and rows of white tents in the neighboring paddy field indicated a large number of Tartar troops. Over 40 war junks were further up the river. As the steamers advanced, the Chinese batteries opened fire, which the British vigorously returned with shells and rockets. HMS Modeste sailed within 300 yards, or 270 meters, of the shore, and fired broadsides before the other ships joined the cannonade. The Chinese forces made a determined resistance, but could not withstand the broadsides. The shells and rockets from Madagascar and Nemesis had a destructive effect, setting fire to much of the camp. The Chinese-controlled Cambridge opened fire and was soon overwhelmed by artillery from the British ships. Her crew jumped overboard to make way for shore. Although the junks made a large amount of noise, they kept out of range of the British fleet. After an hour, the Chinese batteries were nearly silenced, and the British forces landed. Herbert reported, "I landed with the seamen and Marines and stormed the works, driving before us upwards of 2,000 of their best troops, and killing nearly 300. Bingham wrote, "As the enemy fled before Lieutenant Strancham's party, they attempted to cross a deep branch of the river, in which numbers of them perished, and many were shot. The British captured the forts about half an hour after landing. While the land operations were going on, Lieutenant Watson of Calliope and other officers boarded Cambridge and soon captured it. After a resistance from the few Chinese crew that remained, the ship was found to mount 34 guns. Orders were sent to the officer to set it on fire. Shortly after dark, the fire exploded its magazine, hurling the masts and beams in the air." Herbert wrote that the explosion was so loud that it must have been heard at Canton. A total of 98 Chinese guns were captured during the day. The British casualties were 1 seaman killed, 6 seamen wounded, and 2 Marines wounded. The seaman who died on Modeste had the hammer of his musket caught on the ship's thwart, and when the piece discharged, the ball shot through his head. These battles allowed the fleet to move further upriver towards Canton. On March 2nd, the British destroyed another Qing fort near Paljun and captured Wampoa. On February 28th, Lin wrote, "I hear that yesterday the English rebels broke resistance at Wuyang. The regulars from Hunan were stationed there and had heavy losses. Their commander, Xiang Fu, being also among the killed. 100 trained militiamen came afterwards from Xiang Fu's camp, but did not reach Wuyang in time for the attack. And that in the afternoon, Qishan, Deng Ting-zhen, and Yiliang began a meeting." The Battle of Wampoa. Here is an image of Wampoa Island from Danes Island in 1841. On March 2nd, 1841, Commodore James Gordon Bremer, Commander-in-Chief of British Forces, sent Captain Edward Belcher of the HMS Sulphur to reconnoiter the Junk River. The ship was towed by 3 of Wellesley's boats under Lieutenant Richard Simons. As they approached the northeast end of Wampoa Island, a Chinese battery of about 25 guns, which were masked by thick tree branches, opened fire on the ships. Lieutenant Simons immediately cut the tow line. The boats sailed towards the shore, and the boat crews landed. The battery was defended by 250 Manchu Tartar troops. They fled for shelter in the neighboring jungle, but were dislodged by artillery from the sulphur. After the British captured the fort, the guns were destroyed and the works and magazines blown up. Bremer reported 15 or 20 Tartars killed. One British seaman from the Wellesley died from wounds after being shot through the lungs with grape shot. Bremer resigned the command of land forces to Major General Hugh Gough, who joined the fleet on board the HMS Cruiser. He personally directed the attack on Wampoa. Former Imperial Commissioner Lin Zexu wrote in his diary for March 2nd, "I hear that the rebel ships have already forced their way to the fort at Leyte. Early in the morning, I went to talk things over at the general office in the monastery of the giant Buddha." This action threatened Canton's east flank. Superintendent Elliot, who was unaware that he had been dismissed, and the Governor General of Canton, declared a 3-day truce on March 3rd. Between March 3rd and 6th, the British forces that had evacuated Tucson per the Convention of Chuanpei arrived in the Pearl River. The Chinese military was likewise reinforced, and by March 16th, General Yang Fang commanded 30,000 men in the area surrounding Canton. While the main British fleet prepared to sail up the Pearl River to Canton, a group of 3 warships departed for the Xi River estuary, intending to navigate the waterway between Macau and Canton. The fleet, led by Captain James Scott and Superintendent Elliot, was composed of the frigate HMS Samurai and the steamships HMS Nemesis and HMS Atalanta. Although the waterway was in places only 6 feet deep, the shallow drafts of the steamships allowed the British to approach Canton from a direction the Qing believed to be impossible. In a series of engagements along the river from March 13th to 15th, the British captured or destroyed Chinese ships, guns, and military equipment. 9 junks, 6 fortresses, and 105 guns were destroyed or captured in what was known as the Broadway Expedition. The Broadway Expedition. Here is an image of the steamer HMS Nemesis engaging at the Qing Fort and Chinese war junks, March 13th, 1841. Operations began on the morning of March 13th in Macau. Altogether, on board the HMS Nemesis of Captain Hall was the Chief Superintendent of Trade, Charles Elliott, Deputy Superintendent of Trade, Alexander Johnson, and interpreters John Morrison and Robert Tom. The British officer wrote that the interpreters' knowledge of the language and their good judgment frequently enlisted in our favor the people of the country, who might have offered great annoyance, and they were often able to mitigate the hardships even of war itself. Here is a list of forts captured, a number of guns in chronological order. March 13th, Mota, 13 guns. Tayat Cook, 12 to 14 guns. Huchang, 14 to 15 guns, defended by 9 war junks, of which 7 were destroyed and 2 escaped. 28 guns captured. Fei Shu Kok, 7 guns. Further up the river, the fleet reached the trading town of Qiangshan, or Zhongshan. The Nemesis was in chase of the 2 junks, which had earlier escaped, and were followed by several Mandarin boats. 1 junk was captured. It carried 4 guns. Xiangchat, 8 guns. March 14th, Kong Hao, or Hong Hao, 9 guns. March 15th, 1 war junk, 7 guns. Here is a British map of the Pearl River. With the Pearl River cleared of Chinese defenses, the British debated advancing on Canton. Although the truce had ended on March 6th, Superintendent Elliot believed that the British should negotiate with the Qing authorities from the current position of strength rather than risk a battle in Canton. The Qing army made no aggressive moves against the British and instead began to fortify the parts of the city that they controlled. Chinese military engineers began to establish a number of mud earthworks on the riverbank, sank junks to create river blocks, and started constructing fire rafts and gunboats. Chinese merchants were ordered to remove all of the silk and tea from Canton to impede trade, and the local populace was barred from selling food to the British ships on the river. On March 16th, a British ship approaching a Chinese fort under a flag of truce was fired upon. This resulted in the British setting the fort on fire with rockets. These actions convinced Elliot that the Chinese were preparing to fight, and following the return of the ships from the Broadway Expedition to the fleet, the British attacked Canton on March 18th. They took the 13 factories with very few casualties and raising the Union Jack above the British factory. The city was partially occupied by the British, and trade was reopened after negotiation with the Gohong merchants. The March 18th attack on Canton. Here is a map and information about the First Battle of Canton. After several days of further military successes, British forces commanded the high ground around Canton. Here is a sketch of British soldiers occupying the high ground above Canton in 1841. Another truce was declared on March 20th. Against the advice of some of his captains, Elliot withdrew most of the Royal Navy warships downriver to the Boca Tigris. In mid-April, Yishan, who was Qishan's replacement as Viceroy of Yangguang and the Daoguang Emperor's cousin, arrived in Canton. He declared that trade should continue to remain open, sent emissaries to Elliot, and began to gather military assets outside Canton. The Qing army camped outside of the city soon numbered 50,000. The money earned from the reopened trade was spent repairing and expanding Canton's defenses. Concealed artillery batteries were built along the Pearl River. Chinese soldiers were deployed in Wampoa and the Boca Tigris, and hundreds of small rivercraft were armed for war. A bulletin was sent from the Daoguang Emperor that commanded the Qing forces to exterminate the rebels at all points. Orders were given to drive the British from the Pearl River before reclaiming Hong Kong and driving the invaders out of China altogether. This order was leaked and became widely circulated in Canton among the foreign merchants, who were already suspicious of Chinese intentions after learning of the Qing military build-up. In May, many Kohong merchants and their families left the city, raising further concerns about a renewal of hostilities. Rumors spread that Chinese divers were being trained to drill holes in the hulls of British ships, and that fleets of fire rafts were being prepared for deployment against the Royal Navy. During the build-up, the Qing army was being weakened by infighting between units and lack of confidence in Yishan, who openly distrusted Cantonese civilians and soldiers, instead choosing to rely on forces drawn from other Chinese provinces. On May 20th, Yishan issued a statement asking the people of Canton and all foreign merchants who are respectfully obedient not to tremble with alarm and be frightened out of their wits at the military hosts that are gathering around, there being no probability of hostilities. The next day, Elliot requested that all British merchants evacuate the city by sundown, and several warships were recalled to the positions in front of Canton. On the night of May 21st, the Qing launched a coordinated night attack on the British Army and Navy. Artillery batteries hidden in Canton and on the Pearl River, many of which the British believed they had disabled earlier, opened fire. Qing soldiers then retook the British factory. A large formation of 200 fire rafts, connected by a chain, was sent drifting towards the British ships at Canton, and fishing boats, armed with matchlock guns, began to engage the Royal Navy. The British warships were able to evade the attack, and stray rafts set Canton's waterfront on fire. This eliminated the river and foiled the night attack. Downriver at Wampoa, the Chinese attacked the British vessels at anchor there and attempted to prevent ships from reaching Canton. Having suspected an attack, and because of this, delaying his own offensive, General Goh consolidated the British forces at Hong Kong and ordered a rapid advance upriver to Canton. These reinforcements arrived on May 25th at Wampoa, and the British counterattacked, taking the last 4 Qing forts above Canton, as well as the French and Dutch folly forts in the river in front of Canton. Then they began bombarding the city. The Qing army fled in panic when the city heights were taken. And the British pursued them into the countryside. On May 29th, a crowd of about 20,000 Cantonese villagers and townspeople attacked and defeated a company of 60 Indian sepoys in what became known as the San Yuanli Incident. and Go ordered a retreat back to the river. The San Yuan Li Incident. Here is a map showing the military situation of the San Yuan Li Incident. Postponement of the attack on the 4 forts guarding Canton at the Second Battle of Canton left nearly 5,000 British and Indian troops milling around in the sultry heat and moist atmosphere of the paddy fields north of Canton. According to historian Frederick Wakeman, there was no question that looting took place in villages such as San Yuan Li, but on the whole, the troops behaved well. Nevertheless, according to Chinese sources, the rape of a villager, Wei Xiaoguang's wife, obviously by one of the sepoy troops, triggered the incident. After the incident, the incensed local populace, swelled by arrivals from nearby villages, grew into a crowd of 10,000 people. This huge mob then besieged the British on all sides. They were armed with machetes, pikes, and a variety of swords. They lured a detachment of 60 British sepoys, a member of which was the culprit of the crime, into the marshy paddy fields, where the sepoy flintlock muskets, sodden with the heavy rain, failed to fire as the villagers attacked. 4 sepoy troops were killed, with a further 20 or more wounded. The British dispatched 2 units of Marines, armed with waterproof percussion muskets, to reinforce the sepoys. After a 2-hour siege, the British forces withdrew to the western fort. The villagers followed the British troops back to the western fort and surrounded them. Once he understood the situation, the British commander passed a message to Guangzhou Governor Yu Bao-chung, telling him that if the siege continued, the main force of the British Army would raze Canton to the ground. Yu, well aware that this was no empty threat, given the size of the enemy forces, urged the crowd to disperse, which only led to him being branded a traitor to the people. With his reputation in tatters, the only position Yu could obtain afterwards was as a minor official in the department responsible for imperial examinations, where patriotic students would throw ink in his face. At the epicenter of the conflict, a small hill known as Niulangang, at the side of the modern road north to Paljun International Airport, the Guangzhou provincial government on May 23, 1991, set up a simple concrete memorial to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the clash. As historian Frederick Wakeman wrote, out of the humiliating military defeat of the Opium War, they have been able to extract a great popular victory, blemished only by the cowardice of the Qing officials. Today, on the mainland, every child's history textbook contains an account of the battle. Every tablet, every shrine to the San Yuan Li dead has been carefully tabulated by the local history bureau of the province. A Bunker Hill and an Alamo rolled into one. The fighting subsided on May 30th, 1841, and Canton came fully under British occupation. Following the capture of Canton, the British command and the Governor General of Canton agreed to a ceasefire in the region. Under the terms of the limited peace, later widely referred to as the Ransom of Canton, the British were paid to withdraw beyond the Bogue forts, an action they completed by May 31st. The peace treaty was signed by Elliot without consulting the British Army or Navy, which is something that angered General Gough. The defense of Canton was declared a diplomatic success by Yishan. In a letter to the Emperor, he wrote that the Chief General that he would implore the great Emperor in their behalf that he would have mercy upon them and cause their debts to be repaid them, and graciously permit them to carry on their commerce, when they would immediately withdraw their ships from the Boca Tigris, and never dare again to raise any disturbance. However, General Yang Fang was reprimanded by the Emperor for his agreeing to a truce, rather than forcefully resisting the British. The Emperor was not informed that the British expedition had not been defeated, and was very much intact. The Imperial Court continued to debate China's next course of action for the war, as the Daoguang Emperor wanted Hong Kong retaken. Central China. Here is an image of the HMS Wellesley and the British squadron sailing from Hong Kong for the attack on Amoy in 1841. Following their withdrawal from Canton, the British relocated the expeditionary force to Hong Kong. Just as with the Chinese commanders, the British leaders debated how the war should be continued. Elliot wanted to cease military operations and reopen trade. Major General Gough wanted to capture the city of Amoy and blockade the Yangtze River. In July, a typhoon struck Hong Kong, damaging British ships in the harbor and destroying some of the facilities the expedition was building on the island. The situation changed when, on July 29th, Elliot was informed that he had been replaced as superintendent by Henry Pottinger, who had arrived in Hong Kong on August 10th to begin his administration. Pottinger wanted to negotiate terms with the Qing for the entire country of China, rather than just the Pearl River. Because of this, he turned away Chinese envoys from Canton and gave permission for the expeditionary force to proceed with its war plans. Admiral Sir William Parker also arrived in Hong Kong to replace Admiral Humphrey Fleming Senhouse. Senhouse died of a fever on June 29th. Admiral Parker was now the commander of the British naval forces in China. It was agreed by the British commanders that combat operations should be moved north to put pressure on Peking. And on August 21st, the fleet sailed to Amoy. Here is an image of British troops at the Battle of Amoy in 1841. On August 25th, the British fleet entered the Geelong River estuary and arrived at Amoy. The city was prepared for a naval assault, and Qing engineers had built several artillery batteries into the granite cliffs overlooking the river. A purely naval assault was considered too risky by Parker, prompting Go to order a combined naval and ground attack on the defenses. On August 26th, British Marines and regular infantry, under the covering fire of the Royal Navy, flanked and destroyed the Chinese defenses guarding the river. Several large British ships failed to destroy the largest of the Chinese batteries. It withstood over 12,000 cannonballs that were fired at it up to then. So the position was scaled and captured by the British infantry. The Battle of Amoy in detail. Before the engagement, Qing forces prepared defenses along the shores of Xiamen and built batteries on Gulangyu Island. The British began the battle by bombarding the island's batteries for 2 to 4 hours, sources vary, with little effect. Land forces then disembarked their transports and took the batteries with little resistance. The day was noted as being very hot and fatiguing to the men. The Qing force withdrew and the city fell the next day. A garrison force of 550 men, mostly from the 18th, and 3 ships, the Druid, Pylades, and the Algerine, were left moored at Gulangyu to defend Xiamen. Rosa Luxemburg provides a brief account of the battle in her book, The Accumulation of Capital. On August 25, 1841, the British approached the town of Amoy, whose forts were armed with 100 of the heaviest Chinese guns, these guns being almost useless and the commanders lacking in resource. The capture of the harbor was child's play. Under the cover of a heavy barrage, British ships drew near the walls of Gulangyu, landed the Marines, and after a short stand, the Chinese troops were driven out. The 26 battle junks with 128 guns in the harbor were also captured, their crews having fled. One battery, manned by Tartars, heroically held out against the combined fire of 3 British ships, but a British landing was effected in their rear and the post wiped out. Commander John Elliott Bingham, late First Lieutenant of the HMS Modeste, wrote a detailed first-hand account of the battle from a British perspective. Here it is. The city of Amoy was abandoned on August 27th, and British soldiers entered the inner town, where they blew up the citadel's powder magazine. 26 Chinese junks and 128 cannons were captured, with the captured guns being thrown into the river by the British. As Lord Palmerston wanted Amoy to become an international trade port at the end of the war, Go ordered that no looting be tolerated, and had officers enforce the death penalty for anyone found to be plundering. However, many Chinese merchants refused to ask for British protection out of fear of being branded as traitors to the Qing Dynasty. The British withdrew to an island on the river, where, they established a small garrison and blocked the Judicial River. With the city empty of any army, peasants, criminals, and deserters looted the town. The Qing army retook the city and restored order several days later, after which the city governor declared that a victory had been won and 5 British ships sunk. Fake news once again. In Britain, changes in Parliament resulted in Lord Palmerston being removed from his post as Foreign Minister on August 30th. The Prime Minister, William Lamb, 2nd Viscount Melbourne, replaced him and sought a more measured approach to the situation in China. Lamb remained a supporter of the war. In September 1841, the British transport ship Nerebuda was shipwrecked on a reef off the northern coast of Taiwan, near Keelung, after a brief gunnery attack from a Chinese fort. The Nerebuda had no guns. This sinking was followed by the loss of the brig Anne on another reef at Da'an Harbor near Taichung in March 1842. The survivors of both ships were primarily Indian camp followers and Lascars. They were captured and marched to southern Taiwan, where they were imprisoned. 197 were executed by Qing authorities on August 10, 1842. Another additional 87 died from ill treatment in captivity. This became known as the Nerebuda Incident. The Nerebuda Incident. After the Nerebuda and Anne survivors were captured, the Honga and Yao Ying asked for permission from Beijing to execute them as invaders. On May 14, 1842, the Daoguang Emperor released an edict after the British forces repulsed the Chinese attempt to recapture Ningbo in Zhejiang province. With regards to the Anne prisoners, he ordered, after requiring the confessions, only the leaders of the rebellious Yi, barbarians, should be imprisoned. The remaining rebellious Yi and the 130-odd that were captured last year shall be immediately executed in order to release our anger and enliven our hearts. On August 10th, the captives were taken about 5 kilometers outside the city walls. This was the report in the periodical The Chinese Repository. All the rest, 197 prisoners of war, were placed at small distances from each other on their knees, their feet in irons and hands manacled behind their backs, thus waiting for the executioners, who went round and, with a kind of two-handed sword, cut off their heads without being laid on a block. Afterwards, the bodies were all thrown into one grave, and their heads stuck up in cages on the seashore. 87 other prisoners died from ill treatment while in captivity. Rescue attempts. Between 19th and 27th October 1841, the British sloop Nimrod sailed to Keelung and offered $100 in equivalent money of the time for every Nerebuda survivor. But after finding out that they were sent south for imprisonment, Captain Joseph Pierce ordered the bombardment of the harbor and destroyed 27 cannons. before returning to Hong Kong. On October 8, 1842, Commander William Naval of the HMS Serpent left Xiamen for Tainan, Taiwan. Captain Henry Duchy Chads of the HMS Cambrian ordered Captain Naval to inquire about the survivors of both ships under a flag of truce. By that time, the British were aware that the captives were already executed. Naval brought a letter from Chads addressed to the Taiwanese governor, requesting the release of their survivors, but reported that his reception was uncourteous and his letter not accepted. They were told that the last survivors were being sent to Fuzhou. On October 12th, they returned to Xiamen. When the HMS Serpent arrived in Anping, she found 25 survivors of the 26-man crew of the transport ship Herculaneum and its captain Stroyan. This ship had left Singapore on September 6, 1842, carrying coal from Calcutta to the British ships in Tucson, and had been thought lost at sea. Unlike the Nerbudda and Anne survivors, Captain Stroyan and his crew were well treated, even though they knew the fate of many other wreck victims and were in constant fear of their lives. The reports of the rescue of the Herculaneum crew refer to 197 total survivors of the Nerbudda and Anne. 30 had died from mistreatment, 157 were executed, and there were only 10 survivors rescued at Xiamen. The HMS Serpent arrived in Xiamen with the Herculaneum survivors on October 12th, but the survivors of the Nerbudda and Anne didn't arrive until 2 weeks later, on October 25th. The aftermath. On November 23, 1842, the governor of Hong Kong, Henry Pottinger, condemned the massacre of non-combat personnel and demanded that the Taiwanese officials responsible be degraded, punished, and the property confiscated, with the amount paid to the British government for compensation to the families of those executed. He stated that he had obtained proof that the emperor ordered the execution, but that it was due to the Taiwanese authorities falsely reporting that they were a hostile group who attacked the island, despite the vessels not being warships and the crew not being troops or fighting men. The potential repercussions concerned the Qing government, who had just concluded peace negotiations in the Treaty of Nanking a few months earlier. On January 11, 1843, the emperor ordered a judicial inquiry into the Honga and Yaoying. The governor of Fujian and Zhejiang, Yilang, was dispatched as commissioner to Tainan, Taiwan. After investigations, he reported that both commanders confessed to sending fabricated reports of defending against a naval attack. In April 1843, they were recalled to the capital, Beijing. After being interrogated, they were imprisoned, but released by the emperor on October 18th, having served only 12 days in jail. Later that year, Yao Ying claimed his actions were done to boost the declining morale of the Qing officialdom and troops. On December 16th, the Honga was assigned a post at Hami, Xinjiang province, while Yao Ying received an appointment in Sichuan province. The British were not aware of the posting until Hong Kong Governor John Francis Davis informed Foreign Secretary Lord Aberdeen on March 11, 1845. In 1867, 25 years after the executions, an interview was published in which British Dr. William Maxwell asked an old Chinese clerk in a Tainan office if he remembered the beheadings. He responded in the affirmative and claimed that on the same day a heavy thunderstorm formed and lasted for 3 days, drowning an estimated 1,000 to 2,000 people. I remember that day well, and a black day it was for Formosa, that it was a judgment from heaven for beheading the foreigners, but it was done in revenge for your soldiers taking Amoy. October 1841 saw the British solidify their control over the central Chinese coast. Tucson had been exchanged for Hong Kong on the authority of Qishan in January 1841, after which the island had been regarrisoned by the Qing. Fearing that the Chinese would improve the island's defenses, the British began a military invasion. The British attacked the Qing on October 1st. The Second Battle of Tucson ensued. Here is a better look at the image of the British forces invading and the second capture of Tucson. The second capture of Tucson in detail. The battle occurred on October 1st, 1841. British forces captured the city of Dinghai, capital of the Tucson, or Jushan, Islands, off the East Chinese coast. The fortified city of Dinghai, with a population of 30,000, was defended by the Chinese by a fellow referred to as Kao. After a brief one-sided seaborne operation involving the 55th Regiment of Foot, the city fell to the far superior British forces. The regiment landed on a beach and then assaulted an enemy strongpoint called Guard's Hill. There, it ascended under heavy fire and eventually took the hill. It then proceeded to take the heights overlooking Dinghai, and then immediately descended and placed its regimental colors on the walls of the city. After the battle, a detachment of the 55th and 18th Regiments of Foot were left to garrison the city. They captured 100 iron guns, 36 brass cannons, and 540 gingals. Gingals were heavy muskets or light guns mounted on swivels. The British lost 2 killed and 28 wounded. The British forces killed 1,500 Qing soldiers and captured Tucson. The victory re-established British control over Dinghai's important harbor. Here is the attack on the heights of Tucson. The Battle of Qinghai. On October 10th, a British naval force bombarded and captured a fort on the outskirts of Ningbo in central China. A battle broke out between the British Army and a Chinese force of 1,500 men on the road between the town of Qinghai and Ningbo, during which the Chinese were routed. Here is a British rowboat at Qinghai. Here is the close of the engagement. Following the defeat, Chinese authorities evacuated Ningbo, and the empty city was taken by the British on October 13th. An imperial cannon manufactory in the city was captured by the British, reducing the ability of the Qing to replace their lost equipment, and the fall of the city threatened the nearby Chamtang River. The capture of Ningbo forced the British command to examine their policy towards occupied Chinese territory and prizes of war. Admiral Parker and Superintendent Pottinger wanted a percentage of all captured Chinese property to be turned over to the British as legal prizes of war. General Goh argued that this would only turn the Chinese population against the British, and that if any property had to be seized, it should be public property rather than private. British policy eventually settled that 10% of all property captured by the British expeditionary forces would be seized as war loot in retaliation for injustices done to British merchants. Goh later stated that this edict would compel his men to punish one set of robbers for the benefit of another. Fighting ceased for the winter of 1841, while the British resupplied. False reports sent by Yishan to the emperor in Beijing resulted in the continued British threat being downplayed. In late 1841, the Daoguang emperor discovered that his officials in Canton and Amoy had been sending him embellished reports. He ordered the governor of Guangxi, Yan Changchu, to send him clear accounts of the events in Canton, noting that since Guangxi was a neighboring province, Liang must be receiving independent accounts. He warned Liang that he would be able to verify his information by obtaining secret inquiries from other places. Yishan was recalled to the capital and faced trial by the imperial court, which removed him from command. Now aware of the severity of the British threat, Chinese towns and cities began to fortify against naval incursions. In the spring of 1842, the Daoguang emperor ordered his nephew, Yi Jing, to retake the city of Ningbo. In the ensuing Battle of Ningbo on March 10th, the British garrison repelled the assault with rifle fire and naval artillery. At Ningbo, the British lured the Qing army into the city streets before opening fire, resulting in heavy Chinese casualties. The British pursued the retreating Chinese army, capturing the nearby city of Chixi on March 15th. Here is the Battle of Ningbo in more detail. Prior to the outbreak of the First Opium War, the city of Ningbo had roughly 250,000 inhabitants and was frequented by warships of the Royal Navy. On September 15th, after the outbreak of the war, the British warship HMS Kite became grounded near Ningbo. The survivors of the shipwreck were captured by Chinese forces and paraded throughout the city and countryside in small cages. The mistreatment of the captured sailors by the Chinese influenced the attitudes of the occupying British forces in Ningbo as the event became widely known. The following year, on October 10, 1841, the British captured Qinghai after a fierce engagement between Chinese and British forces. The British soon dispatched the HMS Nemesis up the Young River to discover if it was navigable. Upon discovering that the river could accommodate their large steamers, a Royal Navy fleet sailed to Ningbo. On October 13th, British troops entered Ningbo under the tune of St. Patrick's Day in the Morning. It was played by the Royal Irish Band. They occupied the city unopposed. The capture was a stepping stone in British plans to launch an attack on Nanking as part of their larger strategy to capture Peking. The British planned to occupy Nanking and move up the Grand Canal towards Peking. Occupation of Ningbo. Upon occupying the city, several British soldiers, infuriated by the mistreatment of prisoners of war from the Kite, began to loot the city. Though many in the occupation force condemned looting and prevented their comrades from undertaking any such action. The British burned down the prison where the prisoners from the Kite had previously been kept, along with confiscating the city's municipal funds. This consisted of over £160,000 in the value of the money then. A 10% increase in taxation was also levied on the citizens of Ningbo. Due to the Ningbo police having fled prior to the British occupation, local Chinese freebooters looted the city and extorted money from other locals. Many of these locals were victimized, and those who were victimized expressed their anger by throwing trash and feces at unaccompanied British soldiers. The British officers in charge of the occupation force, Sir William Parker and Sir Hugh Gow, publicly expressed their disapproval of incidents of looting and mistreatment of the Ningbo citizenry. On the other hand, Anglo-Irish soldier and colonial administrator Sir Henry Pottinger felt considerable satisfaction in looting the city. After Pottinger arrived in Ningbo, he ordered the confiscation of all the Chinese ships and provisions and other property, including the main pagoda's bell, which was sent to India as another symbolic prize. He also appointed Lutheran Reverend Karl Gutzlaff, a German missionary, as the highest-ranking civil magistrate in Ningbo. Gutzlaff strictly enforced the laws of the new administration and hired a small group of spies to monitor the city and the activities of the residents, allowing British officials to impose higher taxes on the upper-class citizens of Ningbo. The British also opened up the Public Granary and began to sell the grain contained within to local citizens at cheap prices. Following the loss of Ningbo, the emperor sent his nephew, Prince Yijing, to Suzhou to recruit men to recapture the city and drive the English into the sea. However, most of the troops were poorly trained and unprepared for combat. Despite this, Yijing ordered his force to go on the offensive. They fought several minor skirmishes with British troops outside of Ningbo, being defeated each time. Fearful of possible infiltration by British spies, security was heightened in the Chinese camp. The stated aim was preventing those disloyal to the emperor from coming near Prince Yijing. Plans were drawn up to recapture the city and destroy the Royal Navy warships in the Yang River. One plan called for the destruction of the warships using firecrackers tied to monkeys, who would be flung onto the ships. This plan, as well as plans to use the fire rafts to light the Royal Navy ships alight, were both discarded in the battle. The battle. The Chinese, under the command of Prince Yijing, gathered over 3,000 men for the assault on the city. The original plan had been to assault Ningbo with almost 50,000 troops. However, most of these men failed to muster in time. The British occupation force was also depleted in number, with fewer than 700 soldiers stationed in the city. However, the Chinese plan of attack was exposed when a group of local boys who had befriended the British warned them of the coming attack. On March 10th, at roughly 4 a.m., a British sentry spotted a Chinese soldier advancing towards the western city gate. The sentry repeatedly shouted, "Wei lo," which means "go away" in Cantonese, at the advancing soldier, who eventually responded, "Wei lo mo," will not go, before being shot dead. Some Chinese soldiers had misunderstood their orders and were only equipped with knives during the battle. The Chinese attacked the southern and eastern city walls, overwhelming the British soldiers stationed at the southern city gate. At the western city gate, a group of Chinese soldiers under the command of Tuan Yu Fang approached the walls, and upon seeing that the gate was opened and seemingly undefended, were ordered to capture it by Yu Fang. However, the British had mined the gate and left it open in order to give the impression that they did not mean to defend it. Then, 100 attacking Chinese soldiers were killed in the ensuing blast, forcing them to call off the attack. Meanwhile, at the southern city gate, the attacking Chinese had pushed back the British soldiers stationed there into the city streets, but were eventually repelled by 150 British soldiers under the direct command of Sir Hugh Goh. He even deployed a field artillery piece directly in a city street. British and Chinese officials alike noted that many of the Chinese soldiers were under the influence of opium during the battle, which notably decreased their combat effectiveness. The Chinese retreated, having suffered between 500 and 600 casualties, while the British suffered 5. Historians have noted that heavy rains and mud had delayed the Chinese from swiftly bringing in reinforcements before and during the battle. Following the battle, the British continued to occupy Ningbo until the following spring, when they looted the city one more time before departing. The defeated Chinese retreated to the town of Chiqing, 18 miles north of Ningbo. The wounds suffered by Chinese soldiers in the battle, including shrapnel and bullet wounds, proved exceptionally difficult to treat. During the final phases of the British occupation, kidnapping and murders in Ningbo experienced a massive increase as law and order continued to break down. Portions of the city were being set aflame by Chinese criminals. The British administration executed numerous local citizens found guilty of such crimes. In the 1842 Treaty of Nanking, which ended the war, stipulated that Ningpo would become one of the 5 treaty ports which would be permanently open to foreign trade. Following the end of the war, the city became part of the British sphere of influence in China. The important harbor of Jiapu was captured on May 18th in the Battle of Chapu. A British fleet bombarded the town, forcing its surrender. Here is the Battle of Chapu in more detail. Before the attack, Major General Go divided his forces into 3 parts. A column of infantry on the left of 863 men, a column on the right of 969 men. Artillery was in the center. Go went with the right column, which landed first on May 18th. The remaining troops moved to the rear of the enemy, thereby cutting off their communications with Jiapu. Meanwhile, the accompanying steamers began a bombardment of the city's defenses. A is where the main landing point was. B is where the columns were formed. C is where the Chinese breastwork defenses were, pointing towards the sea. D is an earthen fort, also pointed towards the sea. In Go's own words, the enemy were completely taken by surprise, as usual. They were unprepared for anything except a frontal attack. They gave way on all sides and took to flight, with the exception of a body of some 300 Tartar troops who seized a small joss house and held it with indomitable pluck and perseverance. E is the joss house, where the 300 Tartar troops put up their resistance. F are more Chinese naval batteries pointing towards the sea. More troops were necessary, so the Naval Brigade, made up of sailors and Royal Marines, landed at Point G, just below the Joss House. H is a circular stone battery. J is where a British rocket and gun battery were set up to support the attack on the Joss House. Multiple assaults proved necessary to capture the Joss House, with casualties suffered on both sides. Eventually, it fell. K is the place of the escalade, where British troops were able to climb the walls. L is a bridge repaired by British engineers, over which the 18th and 49th Regiments entered the city. After each of the gates had been captured, the city fell to the British. It was not without cost. Go lost one of his most accomplished field commanders, Lieutenant Colonel Nicholas Tomlinson, who was killed personally leading a breaching party of the 18th Royal Irish Regiment of Foot. The British did not remain at Jiapu long. They captured the city's ordnance and destroyed its arsenals before moving on to Tucson. He Ling, the Manchu commander at Xinjiang, the major city that Jiapu fortifications guarded, received the report of Jiapu's surrender. On June 18th, the Manchus committed mass suicide, likely by poisoning themselves, while the Han Chinese discussed the situation with the British. When hostilities ceased, Chinese official Yilibu returned 16 kidnapped British soldiers to Go in recognition of his courtesy in releasing the Chinese captured at Chapu. The Yangtze River Campaign. With many Chinese ports now blockaded or under British occupation, Major General Go sought to cripple the finances of the Qing Empire by striking up the Yangtze River. 25 warships and 10,000 men were assembled at Ningpo and Jiafu in May for a planned advance into the Chinese interior. The expedition's advance ships sailed up the Yangtze and captured the emperor's tax barges. This was a devastating blow that slashed the revenue of the imperial court in Beijing to a fraction of what it had been. On June 14th, the mouth of the Huangpu River was captured by the British fleet. On June 16th, the Battle of Wusong occurred, after which the British captured the towns of Wusong and Baoshan. The Battle of Wusong. From Wusong, the British would only have to advance 19 kilometers to capture Shanghai. By doing so, it was hoped that they could cut off tax revenues to Peking and force the Chinese government to capitulate. But the campaign needed to be swift and successful before disease could take its toll on the British forces. Casualties from disease could also increase domestic opposition in Britain against the war. On June 13th, HMS Cornwallis and the British fleet anchored off Luzon. Bombardment of the port began on June 16th, with HMS Cornwallis and other warships close inshore, while the transports, laden with troops, stood 4 kilometers offshore. Counterfire from 3-mile lines of Chinese fortification on the north bank of the river caused some casualties, but within 2 hours, British gunfire suppressed the Chinese artillery. The warship's boats were then lowered and started to land the Royal Marines and selected detachments of seamen, who eventually seized the fortifications, spiked the guns, and held their positions until the main land force could be brought up from the transports offshore. Though a majority of the garrison had fled halfway into the battle, Admiral Chen, the Chinese commander, continued to fight until he was eventually killed. Afterwards, Liu Guobiao, Chen's commandant and chief associate, carried Chen's corpse on his back away from the fray and hid it in a clump of reedy grass to prevent it from being discovered by the British. By the evening, with Wusong under control, British troops began advancing towards Shanghai. Soldiers and landed sailors marched along the left banks of the Wusong River, while others moved in steamers towing small boats. The only opposition was from a shore battery halfway up the river towards Shanghai. It was eventually silenced by Royal Navy gunfire. By June 18th, after silencing another shore battery just downriver from Shanghai, the strong force reached the city and occupied it, the next day. Following the Battle of Tucson, Shanghai was looted by retreating Qing bannermen, British soldiers, and local civilians. The fall of Shanghai left the vital city of Nanjing, which is known as Jiangning under the Qing, vulnerable. The Qing amassed an army of 56,000 Manchu bannermen and Han green standards to defend Liangjiang province and strengthened the river defenses on the Yangtze. However, British naval activity in northern China led to resources and manpower being withdrawn to defend against a feared attack on Beijing. The Qing commander in Liangjiang province released 16 British prisoners with the hope that a ceasefire could be reached. But poor communications led both the Qing and the British to reject any overtures at peace. In secret, the Dalguang Emperor considered signing a peace treaty with the British, but only in regards to the Yangtze River and not the war as a whole. Had it been signed, the British forces would have been paid not to enter the Yangtze River. On July 14th, the British fleet on the Yangtze began to sail up the river. Reconnaissance alerted Go to the logistical importance of the city of Zhenjiang, Xinjiang. Plans were made to capture it. Most of the city's guns had been relocated to Tucson and had been captured by the British when that city had been taken. The Qing commanders inside the city were disorganized, with Chinese forces stating that over 100 traitors were executed in Xinjiang prior to the battle. The British fleet arrived off the city on the morning of July 21st, and the Chinese forts defending the city were blasted apart. The Chinese defenders initially retreated into the surrounding hills, causing a premature British landing. Fighting erupted when thousands of Chinese soldiers emerged from the city, beginning the Battle of Xinjiang. Here is the Battle of Xinjiang in detail. In mid-July, the British ships concentrated on Xinjiang and blocked the route between the Yangtze River and the Grand Canal. On the morning of July 21st, the British attacked Xinjiang from 3 directions with 4 brigades. With the support of an artillery brigade, 2,310 soldiers from the 1st Brigade attacked the Qing army defending the outsides of Xinjiang. 1,832 soldiers of the 2nd Brigade attacked the West Gate with the support of the Navy, and 2,155 soldiers of the 3rd Brigade attacked the North Gate. At that time, there were 1,583 bannermen in Xinjiang and 2,700 Green Standard Army troops to the southwest suburb. The Green Standard Army had been transferred from other provinces after the fort outside the city had been attacked. The Green Standard Army troops, who had been temporarily concentrated, were not familiar with the terrain of Xinjiang. Except for a small number of muskets, their weapons were swords and spears. At 7 a.m., the British 3rd Brigade landed at Daegu Mountain and attacked the North Gate, covered by artillery fire from Royal Navy warships. The bannermen guarding the North Gate immediately shot with muskets, injuring 2 British captains. The bannermen dismantled some battlements and hastily set up artillery to counterattack. After a fierce battle of more than half an hour, the artillery of the bannermen was destroyed, and the British troops rushed the battery from the side. The defenders fought the British on the wall of the city. Before dawn, the British 1st Brigade successfully landed and occupied the highlands near Jinshan. At 8 a.m., the British began their attack on the Green Standard Army stationed outside the city. The Green Standard Army troops had traveled a long distance to reinforce the city and were tired from their journey, as well as lacking sufficient food. After a fierce battle, they were defeated. The commander of the Green Standard Army saw fires burning inside of Jinqiang and thought that the city had been lost, so he ordered the remaining soldiers of his command to retreat. Many Green Standard Army soldiers became deserters. The West Gate was the main focus of the British attack on the city. Shortly after the battle between the North Gate and the southwest suburb, the British 2nd Brigade began to attack the West Gate. Soldiers of the 2 regiments in this attack occupied some houses outside of the city to shoot at the defending garrison from undercover. Meanwhile, a ship carrying British Marines sailed along the canal to the West Gate. The West Gate garrison fired at the British Army on land and the Marine Corps in the canal, injuring 16 sailors, 8 gunners, and an officer. The defenders forced the Marine attack from the canal to withdraw within 10 minutes. After that, the British Army sent another 200 Marines to strengthen the land force and renew the attack on Xinjiang, after which they successfully occupied some of the city buildings, fighting street battles with the defenders. At noon, the British sent a team of engineers to blow up the West Gate with gunpowder. At the same time, the British 3rd Brigade, occupying the North Gate, rushed to the West Gate. Finally, the Qing defense was broken. At least 40 British officers and soldiers were killed or injured in the street fighting. After the British completed their seizure of the city, Hai Ling, the supreme commander of the Qing army there, and his family committed suicide. Many Chinese soldiers and their families also committed suicide rather than be taken prisoner. After capturing Xinjiang, the British fleet cut the vital Grand Canal, paralyzing the Taoyuan system and severely disrupting the Chinese ability to distribute grain throughout the empire. The British departed Xinjiang on August 3rd, intending to sail to Nanking. They arrived outside the Jiangning district of Nanking on August 9th and were in position to assault the city by August 11th. Although explicit permission to negotiate had not been granted by the emperor, Qing officials inside the city agreed to a British request to negotiate. The Treaty of Nanking. On August 14th, a Chinese delegation, led by the Manchu High Court official Qi Ying and Ilipu departed Nanking for the British fleet. Negotiations lasted for several weeks as the British delegation insisted the treaty be accepted by the Daoguang Emperor. The court advised the emperor to accept the treaty, and on August 21st, the Daoguang Emperor authorized his diplomats to sign the peace treaty with the British. The First Opium War officially ended on August 29, 1842, with the signing of the Treaty of Nanking. The document was signed by officials of the British and Qing empires aboard the HMS Cornwallis.